Okay, good afternoon, Year 12. So, today we're going to be moving on to what's technically considered a new topic in the Year 12 syllabus, because usually we would have had a test between this lesson and the previous lesson on non-disjunction. But instead we're going to just launch straight through and get through as much of the theory as possible so that when you get back, you can be as far ahead as possible, and we can have some time to go back over the harder stuff with the lessons we'll have gained. So, traditional question is, what do you think this topic is about? So have a glance at that picture. What do we think the topic is about that we're about to cover? And if you're familiar with your biological history, hopefully you recognise that with that many different finches, we're probably going to be talking about Darwin's finches. And if we're talking about Darwin's finches, we're probably talking about natural selection. And natural selection is what we're going to touch on for these 3 lessons. It's going to be a very short little topic. Usually it would come with a double practical at the end. Obviously we'll do that when you get back. But we're going to get that done very quickly. And as I say, hopefully we'll get through quite a lot of theory in quite a short period of time. So, I'm going to start off, we're going to add a little bit more detail to natural selection than we talked about last in Year 11. So, we're going to talk about genetic frequency and genetic diversity and allele frequency, and the concept of reproductive success. Now, a lot of that you will already be familiar with under different words. We explain the principles of natural selection. A lot of that is very similar to what we did in Year 11. And then applying knowledge to unfamiliar information is something that's a bit new to A-level. It's specifically applying natural selection to particular different examples, which we're going to talk about. So let's move straight on. The first question is, and we need to understand this before we do anything else, what is an allele? So what is an allele? Now, hopefully you can all remember at least the term from Year 11, if not what it means. The word allele means it's a version or a form of a gene. So, as an example, if we take a look at the eye colour gene, OCA2, OCA2, there are 2 alleles, one codes for brown eyes and one codes for blue eyes. Now, they're both found at the same point on the same chromosome, the same locus. So if I looked at different people's chromosomes, we all have an OCA2 gene on 2 of our chromosomes, so 2 OCA2 genes. But there are 2 options, brown eyes and blue eyes. They are versions of the gene. Okay. In the same way, everyone has a tongue rolling gene. Everyone has a part of their chromosomes that is dedicated to whether you can or cannot roll your tongue, to the particular muscles that are required for rolling your tongue. But there are 2 options, one for is able to roll tongue, one for is not able to roll tongue. These are the 2 alleles. So, if you didn't know that, forget OCA2, just an allele is a version of a gene, you need to know that. You'll never be asked about OCA2, it's just an example. Okay. So, hopefully not too difficult a question. If 40% of the alleles in a population are brown, what's the proportion of blue-eyed alleles? And I'm hoping that everyone can immediately yell out 60%. And the maths here is really that easy. There's no difficult maths on this particular part of the topic. You could be asked to do this. When we get to Year 13, we're going to do this in a little bit more detail, with a lot harder maths, but for Year 12, this is as hard as it gets. And this is the idea of allele frequency. We need to know again what that term means, and there are a few terms to learn today. Allele frequency, genetic diversity. But allele frequency is the frequency of one allele, i.e. the proportion of that kind of allele which is found in the population. It means if I took everyone's DNA, all of our chromosomes, and lined them up in a dish, what proportion of them would have a blue-eyed allele on them? What proportion of them would have a brown-eyed allele on them? And remember, we have 2 copies of this allele. We have 2 copies of every allele except the ones found on the sex chromosomes. So, in actual fact, you might have an allele frequency of 50% inside your body. What you might have 1 blue and 1 brown. But allele frequency tends to refer to a population, a large group of individuals. If you haven't got that down, pause that there. Fine. So, what is genetic diversity? Now, we all know, I imagine we've all heard of the term. It's something we mentioned very briefly in Year 11. What do we think genetic diversity is? Could you write me a definition for that? What do you think it might be? Preferably using the term alleles. And then, why might being genetically diverse be a good thing for a population is a classic question. It's actually a very important one. So pause for me and have a go at this. Write me a definition and a reason. If you're not sure, have a go. We'll go over it in just a second. Okay, so genetic diversity is the amount of different alleles found present in a population. So, for instance, the genetic diversity for the OCA2 gene is 2. There are 2. Okay, and that's very non-diverse. For other genes, there's enormous amounts of genetic diversity. Now, when we talk about genetic diversity in general, we tend to be talking about the genetic diversity of all the alleles. Now, we don't tend to put a number on that. We tend to say more or less. It tends to be increasing or decreasing. It's very rare you'll say, oh, well, the genetic diversity of this population is 3 billion. That's not something you would do. But you want to say that the more alleles that are present, i.e. the more different versions of different genes that there are, the more genetic diversity there will be. Often it's measured with reference to just a few genes, which tend to be indicators of genetic diversity. So it might be that we have 6 or 7 genes in antelope, which we know that there tend to be a lot of alleles on there. So we can say, well, for these 6 or 7 genes in this species of allele, they only have very few alleles. But on this species of antelope, they have many more alleles, so they are more genetically diverse because I'm measuring these 6 or 7 genes. Regardless, the more alleles there are, the more genetic diversity there is. And then the second bit is the answer to the second question. The more genetically diverse a population is, the more capable it is of withstanding change. And by change, what I mean is environmental change. So increased or decreased water availability, temperature changes, decreases in nutrients or food, changes in the environment, natural disasters, this kind of an idea, even things like new predators and new competitors. So changes that are going to affect the likelihood of things to survive. But why would that be? Now, for this you've got to think about what we're going to be using these alleles for. So, when we're thinking about why it's going to make you more capable of withstanding change, let's take a ridiculous example. Let's say tomorrow some aliens invade the Earth and they eat all the people who have blue eyes. Now, if everybody in the world had blue eyes, that would be the end of the human race. It's obviously not true. And so, in actual fact, the wonderful brown-eyed people, and the green-eyed people, or the red-eyed people, grey-eyed people, will all survive. That's ridiculous, obviously, but take another example, something like the peppered moth, which you probably talked about in Year 11. There's 2 types of that. There's the black peppered moth and the white peppered moth. They're the same species, they're just different types of different variants within that species. So a percentage of that population of moths is black and a percentage of it is white. Now, they used to live on silver birch trees, and therefore you can imagine that the black ones, silver birch trees obviously have white bark, the black ones were eaten quite regularly. Then the Industrial Revolution came along, suddenly all the trees in cities were black. Now, if there were only white ones, then all of the butterflies, all the moths would have died because they would all have been eaten, because they would have stood out on the black trees. Because there was a small percentage of black moths in the population, that species survived. Now we've cleaned up our air, these trees are now white again, and so now, actually, it's now a disadvantage to be black moth again. If there had only been black moths, then nowadays they would all have been eaten. But because there are 2 different kinds of moth, depending on the changes that might happen, there will always be some survivors. So the more diverse, the more genetically diverse your population is, the more likely it is that you're going to have somebody within that species, or a small group of somebodies, who are capable of surviving whatever natural disaster change there might be. Or even just who are better at surviving. Right, now let's think about genetic diversity as an idea. Okay, so the question is, well, there are 4 questions. So I'd like you to have a go at thinking about this and Yeah, do answer the questions. I don't really need full sentences. These are obviously not exam questions. You'll never be asked about sheep and dogs particularly. Just write down a bullet point for each one. Okay. So, how have humans affected the genetic diversity of sheep? Now, this is an interesting question. Probably decreased it is the answer. So, if you think about wild sheep pre-agriculture, there would have been some thin sheep, some fat sheep, some sheep with lots and lots of wool, some sheep with less wool, and there would have been a lot of variation there. Pretty much, we have selected, through selective breeding, for sheep that have lots of wool and lots of meat. They're big and they're fat. Now, all of the thin alleles, if you like, have been bred out over the course of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of generations. Okay, over a long period of time, we've removed any thin sheep. There are not thin sheep anymore. We don't want thin sheep. Similarly, there will have been some sheep which had very small amounts of wool. That's no good for us, so we will have bred out that allele. And so there would have been a lot of different alleles, some for less wool, some for more wool, some for thick wool and thin wool and different kinds of wool, and we have bred out all but the ones that are useful for us to make our clothes with. And so what we've done is we've deliberately removed whole varieties of alleles from this population. How about dogs? Well, if you think about dogs, they all descend from wolves, and whilst there is definitely variation within wolves, there are big wolves, small wolves, thin wolves, fat wolves, there's a lot less variation in wolves than there is variation in dogs. If you think about your Chihuahua and your Great Dane are extremely, extremely different in a way that no wolf is extremely, extremely different. By all the selective breeding that we have done, we have led to an enormous amount of increase in genetic variation. We've selected for mutations that would usually just have died out. There would have been normally no Chihuahua-shaped wolves. But one day a dog is born that is particularly small, and we've thought, oh, that's cute, we're going to breed that one deliberately, and we selected for that allele that causes smallness over the course of time, created a Chihuahua, so that there is a lot more variation in dogs than there is in wolves. We have massively increased the genetic diversity by breeding them to select for weird mutations that look strange. Two questions. If humans were to die out immediately, which would be more likely to survive? That's a matter of preference, but I would argue that probably dogs. They are of a different. There's so much variety there. Pretty much no matter what the post-human landscape looks like, there's going to be one of them that is able to survive in that environment. With sheep, they're fairly dependent on humans nowadays. And whilst some of them would survive, I suggest their population would crash enormously because they just don't have the ability to survive independently anymore. We've domesticated them to such an extent. And that's why on the streets of some poorer parts of the world you can see packs of rabid dogs running around looking after themselves. No one has ever seen a pack of rabid sheep. It's not a thing. And if a new species took over with a different purpose for these animals, and who knows what they might use them for, which would be more likely to survive? Definitely dogs. Because there's such a different variety of dogs that pretty much no matter what purpose they picked for them, they'd be able to find a dog. Sheep are pretty much only good for meat and wool, and that's pretty much it. Because that was what we've selected for, we've removed all other variation. So, the dog, which has an enormous amount of genetic diversity, is better capable of adapting to changes than the sheep, which has a lot less genetic diversity. Fine. Now, let's move on to Darwin's finches. So, the question is, how did we get such a diverse selection of different types of beaks? And this is us moving on to natural selection as an idea. So, hopefully when you're thinking about that question, we're thinking about natural selection, we're thinking about mutations and differences between individuals which are then selected for. Now, the stages we're going to talk about are these ones on the board. Oh, I apologise, that picture's got in the way. That says change in numbers and spread of characteristics. Regardless, we're going to go through the 4 stages individually, so you don't really feel the need to write that down at this point. So, natural selection is the process which causes species to change over time. And this really is quite GCSE. It's actually the same stages we talked about at GCSE. We can apply them in a much more well-rounded way because of what we've already talked about on this topic. So the first stage for natural selection to occur has to be mutation. Now, mutations are obviously changing DNA. We covered that in a whole lesson a couple of lessons ago, so I'm not going to touch on that very much at all. But one day, there's a mutation which changes that A to a T, and maybe it changes that phenylalanine to a leucine. So we've had a mutation that's changed the DNA. It's then changed the primary structure of the protein, and hopefully, if we want any natural selection to occur, it has to have changed the tertiary structure of the protein as well. Remember, changing the primary structure of the protein, i.e. changing what amino acid is there, will have no effect on the organism whatsoever unless it changes the tertiary structure of the protein, which is the complex shape which actually allows it to do its job. So there's a mutation. It changes the DNA. That's the first stage of natural selection, and hopefully this is sounding familiar from year 11. After that mutation, if it's going to cause natural selection, we just talked about this, it has to cause a variation. And there are 3 possible kinds of variations. There are neutral variations, negative variations, and positive variations. In different circumstances, the same variation can be neutral, negative, or positive. So, for instance, if it's extremely cold, it's a positive to be extremely fat. If you live in a desert, it's extremely negative to be extremely fat. That variation would be positive or negative depending on where you live. But you can have positive, neutral, and negative. The vast majority are neutral, they make no difference whatsoever to you. Most of the remaining ones are negative, and just the odd occasional few will be positive. It leads to variation. Now, this will be down to a change in the tertiary structure of the protein, leading to it performing a different function. So an example might be for humans nowadays, a fair few people have a variation in the CCR5 protein on the outside of their blood cells, their white blood cells. That stops HIV entering their cell. And that's obviously a positive mutation leading to a variation. It's because we've changed the amino acids sequence, it's changed the tertiary structure so this protein channel no longer works, so HIV can't get into our cells. And that is obviously a positive variation. And you would imagine that over time, particularly in places where HIV is quite rife, that variation would spread dramatically. The third stage after this is changes in number of offspring. Now, this is where we're going to add something new. This requires there to be more organisms born than can possibly survive. So in most species of animal, there are far more children born to each individual than can possibly survive. So what that leads to is organisms that can survive longer or have more offspring will outcompete their siblings and the organisms around them. Those siblings or organisms around them will die out, and therefore the only ones who should be left are those who are best adapted. And this is called reproductive success. So it's the idea that there's always more organisms born than can survive, and so only the best adapted will survive. The best adapted will have more offspring than everyone else, and therefore, given more time, eventually all the organisms should have that gene. Let's go through that in stages in case you haven't followed me. So the first thing is that if there's a positive mutation, it will lead the individual to have a longer life and more offspring. Okay, this is a general idea. A mutation is only positive if it leads you to either have a longer life or to have more offspring. If it doesn't do either of those things, it's a neutral variation. Right? Example, the tongue rolling allele. you being able to roll your tongue, it's not a bad thing, it's not a good thing, but it's unlikely to lead you to have more children. I can think of very few examples where that would lead you to have more children, more reproductive success, or be more attractive to the opposite sex. And so that is not a positive variation, although it might be something nice to be able to do. Now, what should happen is that your alleles will be passed on to a good proportion of your offspring, the positive allele. Now, not all of your offspring will have that positive variation, but some of them should. The ones that don't will die out. The ones that do will survive and thrive and have a longer life and more offspring. And therefore, stage 4, what should happen is that the characteristic spreads in the population. So if in the first generation there is one organism which has a positive mutation, say this giraffe with a long neck, it's got its variations, positive. If it has 5 children, and these only manage to have 2, then in the next generation there will be 5 offspring with this long-necked allele, but only 4 with the short-necked allele. So we've gone from it being a third of the population to it being over half. And if you go through many generations, over time what should happen is that the alleles spread throughout the population. And this is stage 4. So we've had 4 stages. The first thing that has to happen is you have to have a mutation, a genetic mutation that could be passed on. Now obviously you can have other variations that could be positive or negative. You have environmental variations. But those won't be passed on, and therefore natural selection can't occur because of them. So, mutation, leading to variation, because it changes the tertiary structure of a protein. If that variation is positive, then it will increase your numbers of offspring and increase your lifespan. If you've got lots of offspring, then what should happen is you should have the characteristics should spread to those offspring and therefore spread in the population. Because of this, over the course of many, many, many years, what should happen is that each species gets better and better adapted to its environment, because those who are best adapted will survive and have lots of children and pass on their characteristics. Those who are less well adapted should die, and therefore there will be better and better and better adapted organisms. And that's how we suggest that all of the organisms got their characteristics which makes them so effective. Fine. There's a final thing to say, and then we'll do some questions, and that is that there are 3 types of possible changes to a population: anatomical, physiological, and behavioural. And when we think of adaptations, the kind of standard examples we give are always anatomical. Now, anatomical, from the word anatomy, is some change, some observable physical change in your body. So an anatomical change is it something like having a longer neck in a giraffe, or having stripes on a zebra. It's something you can physically see. A physiological change is a change in the way chemical reactions happen within your body. So perhaps something that increases the rate of respiration in an organism would be a physiological change. Something which increases the rate of digestion of molecules in an organism, and new enzymes being created through mutation, would be a physiological change. And that's the one people tend to forget. It's worth remembering, it does occasionally come up. And the final one is behavioural. That's more obvious as to what it means, something that changes your behaviour but not your appearance. An example, if a mutation leads to an organism being more likely to be awake at night than in the day, that will be a behavioural adaptation. Any of those can be naturally selected for. If you survive better because you wake up in the night rather than the day, then your behavioural change will be passed on to your offspring. But this only works if it's genetic variation. Again, you can have environmental variations, anatomical environmental variations. So, for instance, somebody who covers themselves in tattoos. That will be an environmental, anatomical change. And it might lead them to have more offspring, if tattooed people are seen as particularly attractive in their culture. But it won't be passed on to their offspring, because their offspring will not be born with tattoos. so you can't naturally select for that. So there are two types of variation, genetic and environmental. Only genetic is what we're talking about today, and the genetic changes can cause anatomical, physiological, or behavioural changes. Fine. Now let's look at some questions on this. Hopefully it'll reassure you, because I feel like today's lesson, the difficulty with the natural selection lesson is it can feel a bit GCSE, and it can also feel a bit unclear as to what you're going to be asked. So I'm going to stick some questions on the board, on your screen rather, and I'm going to have a look at them. There's only 4 marks this, so I'm going to ask you to pause your screen now and just have a go at these 4 marks. So, explain what is meant by genetic diversity. Hopefully you just remember that straight out of your notes. A is there's lots of different ways of writing it. Difference in DNA base sequence, difference in alleles, gene or gene pool. If you put it's the number of alleles, you get a mark for that there. Now, apart from genetic factors, what other type of factor causes variation within the species? It's environmental or environment. And then the spotted owl is a bird. Numbers of spotted owls have decreased over the past 50 years. Explain how this decrease may affect genetic diversity. Reduced genetic diversity has fewer different or varied alleles, genes, or reduced gene pool. So, the idea that we're going to reduce the genetic diversity because you've got less alleles. And it's just that simple. It is probably worth writing, maybe adding to our notes from earlier. I'm not talking about the number of alleles per se when I'm talking about genetic diversity. Perhaps I haven't made that clear enough. I'm talking about the number of different kinds of alleles. So if I drop the number of people by 1, I've naturally dropped 2 alleles. But if those 2 alleles are the same as the next guy's 2 alleles, the genetic diversity hasn't decreased. Only if when that person dies, we lose a type of allele that no one else has. So perhaps with genetic diversity, it might be worth changing our definition just slightly to the number of different sorts of alleles, number of different types of alleles, that kind of idea. Okay. Fine. Hopefully that's not too difficult. Now, around this time you will have a seminar on Teams. Please make sure you attend that, and if you have any questions about that, please feel free to ask it there or on Teams to your teacher. Hopefully that's been helpful, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all back in school whenever possible. Have a great day.